Hi, everyone. This is Alan Shimel. Welcome to CISO Talk. In this episode, we're going to take a deeper dive into the healthcare vertical, but with the lens of ransomware, or through the lens of ransomware. For those who don't know, or maybe even those who do, of course, last week, we saw a new threat coming out specifically aimed at hospitals and so forth in the U.S. around ransomware. You know, some have said it's state-sponsored. Others said no, not really the issue. We'll talk about it. But certainly during these COVID months, as I call them, COVID times, we have seen some uptick in ransomware, or maybe we haven't, and it's just I'm more sensitive to it. We have a great panel to talk about it today. We invited back some of the folks from our last panel on healthcare cyber, and we have a new addition. I'm going to introduce her first, and that is Wendi Whitmore from the IBM X-Force team. Wendi, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Hi, happy to be here today.
Great. Wendi, you want to just give people a little background?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everyone. I lead the IBM X-Force team, which specializes in incident response and threat intelligence, as well as training our clients in how to immersively respond to breaches. My background is with the U.S. Air Force and with Mandiant with CrowdStrike. So I've been doing response for a long time and excited to talk about ransomware and threat intel today for sure.
Great. Next up, we have the CEO and founder of Accelerated Strategies Group, Mitchell Ashley. Mitchell, if you want to say hello.
You bet. Good to be here with you and running Accelerated Strategies Group. We focus on cybersecurity as well as digital transformation and DevOps and some other areas. So Alan and I go way back working in the security industry in the early 2000s with a different attack prevention software.
Several different ones.
Several, as it turns out.
That was part of the problem. But anyway, next up is our friend Julian Waits from Devo. Julian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Alan. First of all, happy to be here and participating in this discussion. I think it's very salient to where we are in the market today, especially in light of COVID-19. I am the general manager and public sector vice president for Devo. Devo is a log and security analytics product. Our goal is to help you catch the adversary before they get you. Bottom line.
Absolutely, and worthy. Next up, we have Ben Carr. Ben, CISO with Qualys. Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Hey, Ben Carr, CISO for Qualys. I've been here about 6 months. I think everyone should be pretty familiar with Qualys and what we do in the industry, but fairly a good security vendor in the market, been around for quite a while.
Great. And then anchoring us is my co-host here on CISO Talk, Matt Newfield. Matt is the CISO at Unisys. Matt, hello, welcome.
Always a pleasure, Alan. Thank you, and thank you to the panelists for joining us today.
Thanks. All right, so guys and gals, let's start the conversation. Am I crazy, or have we seen a huge uptick in ransomware since March and COVID and the lockdown and working remotely? Wendi, I would imagine you would have some stats on that from X-Force.
Yeah, I've got a point of view on it, Alan, for sure. So happy to kick us off. The answer, is I think yes and yes, right? We've seen a lot of increased activity across the board. But as so in that ranges right from nation state activity into research into the supply chain related to COVID testing, vaccines, the logistical supply distribution of that. But as it relates to ransomware, I guess the way to start it is what I think we're seeing a lot of is not necessarily like an advance in the malware specifically or the ways that attackers are doing it, but we're seeing them become very advanced in how they're conducting business processes around these attacks. So what I mean by that is that it used to be these ransomware actors, which are largely cyber criminal groups, right? Largely not nation state actors. it used to be that one attack group would go after a full life cycle of an attack. So if you're, corporation A, for example, and that's your target, they would, bring in the malware, they would do the command and control infrastructure, they would then wage the attack themselves. Now they've gotten really smart at saying, well, hey, I'm going to actually outsource to experts. So I'm going to let someone else develop the code for the ransomware. I don't need to deal with that at this point. I can either rent it or buy it from them. I can also rent the infrastructure with which the communications occur and to wage the attack. So if I can outsource those, then as an attacker, I can really then focus in on my end target. And what that means is that once they get inside the environment with initial stages of attacks, largely still through things like social engineering, phishing, that type of initial infiltration vector, then they can spend a lot more time actually focused on how can I get to the most interesting data in an environment and determine what I can encrypt that's going to cause the most damage if I do it. And then once I do that, so what we've seen is these increased dwell times, right? It used to be kind of an average of like 5 to 10 days for these ransomware attacks. Now it's in weeks to months that these actors are staying in environments before they actually start detonating the ransomware malware. And that means they're collecting intelligence the whole time. And they've also then changed the payment streams to where it's not just, I'm going to steal your data, encrypt it, and then ask you to pay me money to get it back. Now I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to then publicly extort you and say, I'm going to publicly name and shame you. And so you can pay me not to do that as well. And then most recently, we've seen also denial of service attacks related to it. So here's a third payment stream of, hey, by the way, I know I already got you on these 2 areas, but I'm also going to conduct a denial of service attack on your environment as well and take you offline. So we're really seeing kind of the multiple ways that organizations now are having to deal with these actors.
Agreed. The rest of my panel, do you want to comment on anything Wendi said, or should we jump from there?
I think I would concur with that. I mean, I've seen numbers as high as, in the third quarter, as high as a 50% increase over the first 2 quarters of the year. So it's been really a significant jump in ransomware. I think, the targeting the healthcare industry right now is particularly questionable, given everything that's going on, right? But there does seem to be a market increase in those areas.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, Julian, you go.
Well, I was just going to say, I was going to agree with everything that's been said. And I know the focus today is healthcare, but I would tell you there's been this a dramatic increase in financial services environments as well.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Matt, I'm wondering what you guys are seeing over at Unisys.
I'd love to be able to add on and throw something that others haven't said, but we're all saying the same thing, and I think we'll switch the topic here, but it's very interesting to watch these increase in attacks against really susceptible organizations such as healthcare that are trying to do good for the country and the world. But it opens up a lot of questions on that I think you're going to jump into, like with some of the laws that are changing. Wendi and Ben and Julian, you hear about these laws, and Mitch, where you can't actually pay some of these threat actors.
Yeah, I think you're referencing the OFAC advice that came out on the 1st of October. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how's that going to change? And there was another set of articles that have come out recently where there are a lot of organizations, both state organizations as well as cyber organizations, that are saying you should never pay anyway, because if they say pay me and we'll delete your data, well, how do you know they deleted your data, and why would they delete your data, and what's going to stop them from exposing that data later on? And there's been talk I hear in some of the federal circles where they're like, the only reason you would pay to keep that data out is to try to hide the fact that you had a breach. So how does that tie into a lot of what we're seeing? I think could be a good conversation, Alan.
Yeah, and I wonder in a way if that OFAC advisory, if that was almost in a way, I mean, in retrospect, I look at it and say, well, was there some air cover there, right? Was that an effort to kind of tamp this down with the increase of ransomware, the publicity around it? And, I think, I've been asked in the past by boards, like, do we pay? Like, what's your advice as a CISO? What's your advice as an expert in the area? And I think, typically it's always been, that standard terrorism response of, we don't pay ransomware terrorist demands. But at the same time, I think some people look at it and say, is it just less costly to get out of it, right? And I think it may be, I don't want to ever think that the Department of the Treasury is thinking in a necessarily a super smart direction, but maybe that was some type of air cover to be able to say, in these public incidences they're happening, we're not allowed to. We're just not allowed to pay, right? I mean, that'd be a good way to tamp it down in some aspect. I just wonder if that's going to manifest.
I think there's also just the need to get back to business, right? Getting data encrypted so you can begin operations, stop losing money, whatever the impact is. That's also got to be, of course, a big motivation for
That's always been the cybersecurity, right? That's always, look, I remember seeing reports 20 years ago when we were seeing, 15 years ago when we were seeing the big retail breaches before Target, right? Yeah. Old time retail breaches where the attitude was, well, this could have been pretty easily stopped. But from the retail industry, it represented about 0.05 of an impact on revenue. And it's going to cost us about 0.10 to really implement security. Screw it. For a 0.05, we write it off as a rounding error.
Question. Do we fix the gas tank, or do we weather the lawsuits that'll come from the gas tank?
And for too long, that was a real security. That was the problem we faced in security as CISOs. We didn't even have CISOs then. As security folks, that was the problem, right? It was. Yeah. Is the fix more costly than the one I'm fixing?
But the problem now, real quick, Alan, and I'll pass it back to the group here. When you talk about in the past that breach, that ransomware stopped us from delivering business, right? Whatever company that may be, that's one thing. But when you're talking about, and let's go back to the original topic here, healthcare,
human life
records, and you're a hospital that maybe had the money, maybe didn't have the money, maybe had the expertise, maybe didn't have the expertise to prevent it. And everybody's an armchair quarterback in the cyber world. They always come in and go, why didn't you? How did you not notice? But now you've got people's personal medical records out there. And I can see, and I've been part of conversations where, like, I want to pay the ransom to protect the people. We're going to expose, we have to come out. But I don't want their medical records out there, and making that illegal to do so potentially could open up some very interesting, I'll just leave it at conversations. And I don't know.
I'd highlight even a step up above that, Matt. It's like, if you think about from a medical side, I think, if we go back in history and look, 10, 15 years ago, there was a lot of concern, and there still is significant concern over power grid, right? And the implications that could happen and what could happen if the power grid went down. But I want to say it was maybe a month ago, there was a report out of the first patient that had actually potentially had a health impact, had died as a result of a cyber incident. And I think, from a healthcare perspective, one could think there's nefarious purposes behind that, of like, if you actually cause an impact where it's injuring a person's health, well-being, or life, like, does the pay or not pay thing go out the window at that point for a healthcare institution, right? And that's really where some of the motivation may get to.
That situation too was actually in Dusseldorf, and the patient died because he had to be moved to another hospital. He couldn't get the services where he was going. So it was just being available, more or less. Something happened while he was there. That's pretty interesting.
Julian, you wanted to mention?
My point was, and there's no insurance for that, right? Can you get insurance for ransomware? Of course. But can you get insurance for, ransomware that ultimately causes someone to lose their life? No, that's like insuring the entire business. And so I agree with Ben that I think the IRS, Department of Treasury provided this air cover, but I consider it unethical for a health institution not to look at the health of their patients first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let me put the cherry on this, and we'll continue. We can't have this conversation in the vacuum like this is normal times. This isn't normal times. We're in a worldwide pandemic with ICU beds at a premium. And today's ICU beds, what makes them an ICU bed? Well, besides there's oxygen and everything, the technology in there, they don't run without great technology and telemetry. That's what makes a great ICU, right? And when you're talking about encryption and being able to shut down this kind of stuff now, it's a guttural instinct, I think, for humanity to say, what kind of scum would do this during now, right? I get it. You don't never miss an opportunity to miss a crisis, but to do this now, that I think is what, in normal times, it's a terrible thing to do. And now it almost rises to a crime against humanity to me.
Yeah, but,
right?
I think a lot of this.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't want to cut you off, but I do think
I said my piece.
I think more and more of it is becoming nation state related.
You think so?
Yeah, I think for our adversaries is a great time to really take us to our knees.
Well, I think there's 2 points to that, Julian. It's like, I think from a nation state, and I'd be interested in Wendy's perspective on this, is that, there's twofold to that. There's one is the political and the nation state against nation state kind of, issues. But then there's also, I think, nation states looking at a way to monetize, right? Looking at non-traditional ways to monetize stuff. And those both raise the impact for this and raise the likelihood of this happening. And I think when you look at healthcare specifically, I don't think it's a secret to anybody, hopefully not here, but probably anybody listening, is that healthcare's typically been underinvested, right? From a cyber perspective, it's significantly so, right? And I think they've looked at it from a HIPAA leakage violation perspective. They've looked at it at patient records, right? And I think we need to elevate that discussion out of, it's not just patient records, right? It is patient sustainability and survivability in some cases.
Yeah, I think following on to what Ben said, so a couple of things with healthcare and why it's being targeted in particular, right? I mean, again, I think most of these attacks, a majority of them, the intent is to make money, right? So and people are more desperate than they have been before in today's economy, right? With the workforce having shifted due to the pandemic to be able to generate income. So healthcare providers are a really susceptible target for ransomware attacks, because of the fact that they're much more likely to pay a ransom to get their systems back up and running, right? Their systems are also more vulnerable, or their networks are more vulnerable because of the fact that they have a lot of older unsupported medical devices running. And then as they have shifted towards, the need for electronic communications and hosting of all that data, you can kind of see these worlds coinciding, right? As like a train wreck is coming, and how are we going to get out of this, right? So I think for those reasons, healthcare is a target for these attackers. It becomes really effective. I certainly don't disagree that this is this is incredibly dishonorable and certainly criminal in cases. Absolutely, in the case of the German individual who lost their life due to these attacks. I think the unfortunate reality, though, is that we're going to continue to see these types of attacks be monetized. And, today I talked about kind of 3 different ways they're monetized. We could probably talk 2 months from now, and there's a few more that are going to be uncovered before we really have an effective way to stop them at scale.
And what makes all this worse, if you really wrap everything that I've heard, you also put in, if you think of a normal corporation, there's programs where you can train, because you hear companies like Unisys, we do security in everything we do, and you can make it that foundational. But as we've discussed, Alan, the last time we had a healthcare conversation, if you look at a majority of the people that work there, their number one focus is making sure their patients are okay, right? It's the delivery of healthcare. Anything you put in their way, security, anything that slows down the ability to get the scalpel, to get them on an operating table, to provide that necessary care, to get them to a hospital, legacy was considered a detractor, right? It went against that Hippocratic oath. And Ben, you said this a little bit, and Wendi, you were just touching on it, but changing that mentality in these organizations to make security and the security of our patients, the security of those medical records, to be part of that foundational mindset, I think is very critical, but very hard to do. And
add to that, the fact that most hospitals aren't highly profitable. So to your point, they're thinking about the next heart rate measuring machine or some device to do surgeries more efficiently, rather than thinking about security. And so it's also an issue of access to funding for many health institutions.
And it's
right.
kind of circular, Julian. So that's exactly what I was going to touch on is if you think about from a funding perspective, like a lot of the devices, it's kind of this circular problem where a lot of the devices they have are really old, like we would consider really old, right? Sometimes 20-year-old devices in the environment. And the problem is they weren't built for security, right? And so they're not patched, they're not updated, they're not fixed, there's no funding to do that. And so those are the devices that aren't scanned, they're not secure, they're treated as kind of like, don't touch this device because if it goes down, it'll cause impact to patients. Yet at the same time, that makes them naturally the most fragile devices, that they're the most sensitive to having impact to patients when somebody attacks it from a cyber perspective. And so getting out of that cycle, that logic, we have to change that paradigm. And really, it goes back, it's the same thing in IoT, it's the same thing in healthcare. It's making sure that we're addressing this root capability to be able to secure devices when when they need connectivity.
I was just wondering in the short term or the next couple of years it's a target-rich environment, right?
Yeah.
Capacity of ICU beds is going down. More people are getting sick. Guess what? Probably the ransom amounts are going to go up too as well. So it seems like in the next, I don't know, at least for the foreseeable future, there's going to be a lot of hurt as we see more increases of this kind of an attack.
Well, and we can't just focus on tomorrow. It goes to conversations we've had in the past. Ben, you bring up a good point, and Julian, you were touching on this as well. So who ultimately is responsible? The hospitals aren't making a lot of money. They're buying the equipment. The manufacturers are not developing equipment that can be secured. We've all seen a lot of the agreements and licensing for this equipment has operating systems that can't be patched. If you touch the OS, you're in trouble, or there may not even be a mechanism to provide an upgrade, even though they're sitting on a modern operating system at the time. Without causing problems or, a lot of money. We deal with people who bought these large devices and, if you patch it, you void the warranty. You void everything. And so who's responsible? The hospital has to deal with that. Why aren't we holding the manufacturers of these devices more accountable for the vulnerabilities they're introducing into our healthcare systems?
So I think that's critical in healthcare, but it's critical across almost every industry, right? Like I did that when I was in a role at public companies where we would deal with vendors and they would come in and we would that was part of the policy. Like you had to meet security protocols and policies and the ability to patch or address things within a certain time frame, or you were a much higher risk threshold, or potentially we wouldn't do business with you, right? I mean, I think people have to start taking those approaches to dealing with companies because I think that's the reason we're not holding the manufacturers of the devices responsible for actually taking due care in a long-term sustainability model.
Yeah, but I think until there are more people, and I hate to say this, who are injured or impacted by this, there's not going to be much change in the.
Always the same story, man.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah,
it's
until there's public outcry.
No, I learned this early on in the security. So Still Secure, the company Mitchell and I did together, was my first pure play, we didn't call it cyber, security company. And the thing I realized early on, because we thought everyone would want to buy a $6,000 appliance. What's to think about? But the thing we learned early on is that our best customers were people who had been hacked.
Right.
Best database security sales version was the day of or after the attack.
Yeah. So I started thinking maybe we should have some of our good security people go pat people, and then that's who our salespeople would call the day after. Someone told me we could go to jail for that.
We didn't do that. We did not do that.
We did not do that. But seriously, that's always been the problem here.
You can draw out the graph of adoption, right? It's a quick spike, 100% vertical, and then it falls off rather logarithmically, right?
It's crazy. But one of the things we didn't have then that we have now is sort of the whole threat intel industry, right? The idea of forewarned is forearmed as best we can, given limited budgets, resources, everything else. Wendi, how much is that helping in this current environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. I mean, we certainly like to think it's helping a lot, right? But I think you've got to parse it by, the types of attacks. So from like a nation state actor perspective, right, we've got a tremendous amount of intelligence on that. And from a perspective of working with organizations to give them heads up on activity, really strong there as an industry, right? I'm not just speaking particular to my team. I think though, like when you get into threat intel, this is kind of an interesting discussion, taking it back to the Department of the Treasury and OFAC guidance, in that, their guidance is if you are a company who's a victim of a ransomware attack and you pay an actor a ransom that we have imposed economic sanctions on, then you're potentially exposing yourself to fines. Well, I mean, how do we actually all agree that we've got, complete threat attribution, right, on that actor, especially when these are usually like cyber criminal groups, right, that are conglomerations of probably a number of different countries, right? So I think in some cases, that kind of works certainly in the organization's favor. The fact that, we're still not too always a science when it comes to those things, right? And from the perspective of saying, yeah, we've got one member who maybe was part of from an Eastern European country, or a multitude of them, and which of those countries then are open to economic sanctions or under them, gets pretty confusing. But no doubt, I mean, you look at like the election, I would say, and kind of bringing that back to a current, today and yesterday type of activity. I think the fact that we went through the election without like a major takedown of, election results, of services, certainly there was a lot of activity leading up to, going into it. As part of it, there's a lot of disinformation campaigns, different discussion. But the reality is, I think we, the United States, kind of successfully thwarted a major attack on Election Day. And that was primarily due to a lot of the threat intelligence that was out there, and then close coordination between private and public sector organizations. So I think there's a tremendous amount of progress made there.
Absolutely. Sorry, Matt?
Well, I was gonna say, and Wendi really hit on a big point for me. What I've seen when you hear people like Wendi talk and Ben and team, it's the ability to do that collaboration. I think in the past, and again, this all ties to a lot of the conversations Alan and I've had, where people used to look, and Ben may look at Wendi as a competitor, so we're not going to share intelligence, and you can't share intelligence with a federal agency because that could be looked poorly upon. And we're starting to see in a pretty big way the understanding in industry that we're on the same side. We should be sharing much more, because your success is actually my success, especially when it comes to cybersecurity, threat intelligence.
It always amazes me, Matt, how many people don't take advantage of resources that are out there. So, InfraGard's obviously one, right? That's kind of that private federal. But then the ISICs, like I know it always amazes me how many people aren't even aware that they exist, right? So the retail ISIC, the financial services ISIC, the IT ISIC, like if you're not participating in those organizations and doing that intelligence sharing and getting into that closed door session where you can open the kimono, you can have the discussions with honesty, even with competitors, to protect the industry, and then outside of that, carry on your normal business. I think you're just missing out on one of the really successful ways that you can kind of combat some of that and get information where it's not available elsewhere.
You're missing the fundamentals. It's not that you're missing out. You're not doing the basics. It's like driving without a driver's license and absolutely no education, and doing this and not paying attention to the road signs. I mean, these are basic things that we should be doing, and you're right. I talk about it.
But it's the same thing. This happens across the industry, right? How many organizations still don't have a CISO or a person responsible for security in the organization? How many organizations don't have great asset management, know where their assets are? How many organizations aren't doing cyber hygiene and patching and vulnerability management? Just because it's not the sexy stuff, like they're continually worried about how much budget they're spending, when I think, again, the ISIC is not that much of an investment a company to participate in, and the return on investment is huge. So I think really it's doubling down, like you said, on those fundamental capabilities that a lot of organizations aren't taking advantage of.
Yeah, and I would tell you that especially so in healthcare.
Especially
like Wendi, how many, I can see major hospital systems doing it, but how many hospitals really have a threat intelligence service that they've employed? in the business that they do every day. I mean, for most, cyber hygiene in some form is there, but a coordinated, risk management program that then drives into my operational security program, it's rare I've seen that in healthcare institutions.
Yeah, I'd agree. A lot more growth, I think, needs to be done in that industry. Just in particular, Julian, as you mentioned, kind of the small regional facilities, right, which deliver a lot of business, take care of a lot of patients, but just have nowhere near the budgets to be meeting basic requirements, and then integrating threat intelligence into that. I think in many cases goes above and beyond.
Right.
Oh, but quite frankly, right, this again is not a Johnny-come-lately problem. This is a problem we've seen. A couple of things. First of all, it always seems though the security industry always talked about healthcare as a number 2 or 3 vertical after finance and or government, right? They've never really. There's been few organizations that are really kind of just focused on that healthcare vertical from a cyber point of view. My friend Mike Murray used to be at GE Healthcare. He's just spinning one up now that's going to be involved in it. But it's absolutely true. We've done that. The other thing is, and I realized this at the end of my still secure tenure, security's hard. Cyber security is hard. And when you, Wendi, say, yeah, I want those smaller mid-regional healthcare providers to take security more seriously, it's too hard for them. I think that at some point you got to say, do I outsource it? Is that the only way? Is that my best way to be reasonable about cybersecurity or not?
Both of those points you brought up, Alan, come back to money. It's a money thing, right? Like GE Healthcare vendors, the industry that doesn't focus on healthcare, because like if you go to it and you try to focus on that vertical, it's really hard to get $1 out of that, right?
That's exactly right.
I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that's
no, it's true. I saw it firsthand.
Yeah.
Julian, you wanted to say something?
No, I was agreeing with Ben. It's a really tough sale. You'll go through if it's enterprise software, a 6-9 month sales cycle, and the next thing you find out is that the budget went away because there was another priority, which was around buying some kind of medical device or something.
Yeah, like CAT scanner or something.
Yeah.
I mean, we had it worse. Mitchell and I would go to hospitals trying to sell them NAC, and the CIO or the chief security person they didn't have a chief security person, but the guy who was in charge of security would love it. And then someone would say, wait a second, are you going to tell Dr. So-and-so that he can't get on with back then it was beepers. He can't get on with his beeper or phone because he didn't pass a NAC test? Forget. What happens if he doesn't want to treat patients here? We're done.
That's exactly right.
So one of the things we haven't talked about in this, we talk about the devices, we talk about, adversaries getting in because they're not patched, but, I'd be interested in the intel everybody's seeing on, we call it insider accidents, right? Try not to call it insider threat, but, the accidents that people who are not focused on cyber do. The joke we always get is everybody likes to click links for some reason. I've never quite gotten it. I try to equate it to they're in Las Vegas and they like to pull the lever. But people love clicky. In healthcare, how do you train someone that may not want to be trained, that doesn't care, right? They don't, again, speed. It's all about speed. If they're going to see something on their phone, they're going to click it. If they're moving too fast, how do you educate? How do you train these people? When you talk about intel, but how do I give intelligence, cyber intelligence, to a hospital administrator that's more worried about the doctor showing up to do the surgeries they need than putting barriers in?
Well, I think one of the things that we focused on talking to our clients about throughout the pandemic, regardless of what industry they're in, is just the need to actually do simulation testing, right? The need to walk through these. Cybersecurity is not just a technical issue at this point, right? In order to have a successful response to it, you've got to bring leadership in, and you've got to have different owners of business understand that everyone plays a part in this. So it would be, I'd have that same message, right, to a healthcare organization, that we've all got to realize that, as a doctor, for example, they may own a particular type of data or sets of data in applications and be responsible for that. And everyone has to realize that they play a role. And ultimately, the success of organizations in responding, to breaches is how fast you can detect and how fast we can limit the impact of that access, right? Well, whatever the access may be, into the rest of the environment. And I think it's really critical that organizations, understand and adopt that. And just like, I wouldn't run a marathon tomorrow without ever having, run a few miles to train for it, right? I wouldn't expect an organization to go through a breach the first time and do it extremely successfully, right? We've got to practice these things. We've got to understand where some of the gaps exist in our environments. And ideally, we do that prior to an attack.
Yeah, I think tabletops are a really great idea, Wendi. And then, as you said, bringing the executive teams in, right? Bringing the board in, letting them actually walk through it in a real world example that's simulated, letting them understand and letting everybody get that muscle memory how to respond. I'd also, you mentioned training, Matt, and I think the way we do training is pretty poor in general. Like it's really dry. It's like compliance training every year. Like no one wants to go through any compliance-oriented training, no matter whether it's security, IT, diversity, whatever. Like just nobody likes it. And I found a couple companies that do it more with like live action comedy, and I found humor to be a really successful way to broach that gap of people wanting to consume the training. So I think like our approach to how we bring not just the board and the executives, but the day-to-day, the nurse, the doctor, the orderly on, like how do we bring them in to want to make that part of their everyday work life, right? Like just to be the awareness, raise the awareness some. I think that's really key in that, like we haven't done the job of the psychology of our job, right? Yeah. It's been very technical. And I think that's failed us at the business, like going in and being able to talk business at the business. And it's failed us at the HR level of being able to interact with our customers. Like how often do we say, oh, that's the stupid end user? It's like, well, the guy's not stupid. He doesn't know. He doesn't have all the experience and the knowledge and the training you have. And like, we need to treat them in a different way and understand there's a psychology behind it, that we need a broader spectrum at our management levels within security to consume that and then figure out a way to bring it out to the rest of the org.
I think it was Julian who brought it up a little while ago. It's people don't until there's a failure, until there's that thing, another thing. Julian, you and I were talking about this in one of our conversations. Until it becomes personal, and I think you're correct. Our training is very dry, generally across the board. I'm not insulting Unisys or Qualys or IBM or anybody's corporate training, but in general, it can be very dry, and it's also, I think, wrong from the start. We seem to want to have training that always ends with a pass because it makes people feel good when they pass, and you don't learn that way. And that, Julian, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that, but that need to pass, that inability to accept failure, especially in healthcare, seems to be a big deal.
No, because a lot of times what you have, if you just deal with doctors, right? Many times you have doctors who are highly technical. They're very savvy, but they don't know anything about security. And so there's a bunch of assumptions that go into it. And unless you can somehow pull them into the process of wanting not to be the problem, they continue to be the problem. And, but I mean, I hate to keep going back to it. I still think that if it's not driven from the top, and in healthcare institutions, as you know, most doctors they aren't employed by the hospitals they work for. They're contractors. So trying to force them to do anything can be impossible. But usually the upper management is afraid to do stuff like this because they're afraid of having especially the better caregivers go to other places where they consider there to be less hurdles for getting their work done. But it's got to start at the top. Unless they change that mindset, it's just going to continue to be bad, and we're going to see more and more ransomware in hospitals.
Not to make this about the election, but there's an interesting maybe lesson to learn, sort of a gamification approach we could take to training. I saw some news programming on TV where they were showing individuals different posts on Facebook and things. Is this a fake or is this real? And they'd vote, and half the time, 3/4 the time, they'd be close, but they'd be wrong quite a bit. And the lesson wasn't, here's how you recognize it. I think the lesson was, just don't trust it if it's not a known trusted source. That's what you really need to. You don't need to know, don't click on anything. You need to know, only trust what you know is true, is a reliable resource. And that's, so that gamification made it real to people without them feeling stupid because they didn't know, right? Most people are not going to be able to recognize a phishing attack that's done really well.
Well, the other thing I would highlight it and jump off of that would say, like, if you have an issue that you're trying to figure out in security and how to address it better, who do you reach out? Who do we reach out to? We reach out to people we know and other security professionals, right? And I actually think sometimes we need to reach out to people outside the industry to answer some of these problems. So I read an interesting article, I think it was in World War II. They did an analysis of bombers that had flown back and where they had gotten hit, right? Bullet holes. And so they wanted to find out, where do they enhance the armor on the plane to increase the odds of the planes coming back and landing safely? And so you would naturally look at that picture and the average and say, all right, well, wherever the bullet holes hit the most is where we need to add armor. But that's counterintuitive, and it's involving a bias that you have to say that those planes landed. What you really need to analyze is, where don't you have any holes? Because that's the planes that actually didn't make it back.
Right.
And that's where you need to actually apply more armor, right? Is because the planes that made it back with those bullet holes, they had sustainable injuries, right? And what we need to do is leverage, I think, professions, like, again, I think, psychology, behavioral analysis, right? Data science, right? To understand, like, the things that where we're missing this, because it's obvious we're missing things on how we educate our end users and consumers. We're just missing that, especially in healthcare. Again, I think, Julian, you hit it off. Like, they're not even necessarily employees of the organization, right? It's a conglomeration of these different groups working together in this kind of body, this entity, but you don't necessarily have control over it.
Exactly. It's tough.
I couldn't agree more. So, we're coming up to our time. Unfortunately, it looks like Alan dropped off, so we'll go close out here. I really appreciate it, and I'd love to close this conversation with some final words from everybody. I think one of the things that we're trying to do with this program is impart some wisdom and some advice and maybe some tactical things that people can do as next steps within healthcare, within their own organizations, to try to not prevent ransomware from impacting your company, but things that we can be doing as an industry to really try to help others in this field. So, Mitch, I'll start with you.
What I take away from this, from the panel, is it's about people, it's about business, it's about process. Technology is in there, but that's not the thing. That's where rubber really meets the road, is with us and treating people, dealing with the psychology, all of those things. So that was super, super helpful. I appreciate everybody sharing that.
And by the way, it makes me very happy because my degree is in psychology. So yay, my degree.
I did not know that ahead of time. But
I didn't know that either.
I would love to say I did that on purpose, but I always tell people I wanted to be a psychologist until I realized I don't like listening to people. Ben, next.
Yeah, so my takeaway is, or advice that I would give is plan ahead. Right, I think a lot of people get into these situations where they're dealing with, should I pay the ransomware? Shouldn't I pay the ransomware? Right? Like, what do we do in this situation? How do we recover quickly? And so, I think Wendi had brought up the tabletops. I think finding a way to plan through it, ask these questions ahead of an incident happening, and understand things are going to change. You're going to have to call audibles, right, to make sure you can react. But at the same time, it's going to be a lot more calm disposition, and that's what, as a CISO, I think you want to bring, is calmness of disposition to that discussion, to be able to respond intellectually as opposed to emotionally.
Julian?
So my advice would be, like anything with security, what's the purpose of security? It's to provide protection and a better usage of the resources that a corporation or entities have. In the case of hospitals, better security equals better healthcare. And so if the services that you need, the technologies that you need aren't available to you, you're not going to provide the same level of healthcare that you would if it was there. So it has to be an integral component to you doing the job that you do, which is helping people.
I love it.
Love that.
Wendy?
I think all of the things that have been highlighted so far are all great, right? And certainly Ben would have kind of stolen from me the training, which I could not
Sorry,
agree
Wendy.
more with. No, all good. I love the, we're hitting it kind of multiple times, but I will say I certainly agree with Mitch in terms of that people are the heart of what we need to solve here, but taking it to a technical thing or technical tips, if you will, just a couple things that we see over and over again. Lack of multi-factor authentication on remotely accessible devices. That's something that every organization, I think, can focus on identifying and saying, all right, let's prioritize these, and then let's figure out how quickly we can get multi-factor authentication on. There's a lot of great solutions out there. And then second is just backups. Having backups of your most critical data and having it available offline. Again, we say that different towards every industry, right? There's not one solution that's going to fit for everybody. You've got to prioritize in terms of what is your most critical data. Some of the solutions are costly, but if we can do that and have backups that aren't on the network, that don't also get encrypted when a ransomware attack occurs, the better off we're going to be in terms of not even having to have these type of discussions.
Wendy, you took mine, so I'll throw in my piece of advice, and I think we touched on a lot here. It's make friends and communicate, talk to people, join these groups, get the information, the intelligence, and get support. A lot of times within an organization, it may be hard if you're employed there to convince doctors, administrators to do something, but bringing in friends, trusted advisors, it doesn't always have to be an expensive contract. I've brought in different organizations, industry experts to have breakfast or lunch or dinner with certain leaders in an organization just to help bring that external perspective. Can go a long way in helping to change people's minds on the importance of cybersecurity. And Alan, I see you're back, so I'll hand it back to you for final words.
Thanks, guys. My machine rebooted there. I apologize. But you know what? First of all, my final words, what a panel. What a panel. I mean, what a great discussion. I probably could have done this for half a day and we still would have more to talk about. But so thanks to each and every one of you. Julian, Ben, you came back. We did a redo here, a part 2 anyway. I appreciate it. Wendy, you really, put the cherry on top of this Sunday. It was, thank you so much. Matt, Mitchell, my cohorts here, thank you. We'll be back with another CISO week in about 2 weeks, another CISO talk in about 2 weeks. But for now, this is Alan Shimel for CISO Talk. Hey, stay careful, stay secure out there. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.